Let's talk about a topic that at best confuses people and at worst strikes fear into the heart of many a Magic the Gathering player. And that's cutting cards from our commander decks. I like to think that I'm pretty good at deck building. So I'm going to share how I review a deck to know what's working, what's not, and what should be added. I'm also going to look to answer the most common question that I get on most of my deck building videos, which is what would you remove to add in upgrades? I'll be using my Meren deck as the vehicle to explore this topic, which I think is pretty fitting, as she was the first commander deck that I built a few years ago. There have since been many sets, many new cards, and lessons that I've learned about this deck, so a good old fashioned tinkering session is well overdue. I typically start this process with a review of my existing deck. I then look at what I may want to add, and finally make the swaps. Here are three key things I think about when assessing whether my deck needs changes or not. First up, is my deck smooth to play and not clunky? By that I mean, do I find that I'm often stuck with cards in my hand that I can't cast all game? Or do I splooge out all my cards in the first few turns, only to top deck all game and then be sad? I hate clunky decks, so this for me is a top priority. Then secondly, is my deck doing what I want it to? In the case of Meren, I want to fill my graveyard with as many useful creatures and big scaries as I can. I then want to bring them back from the dead, and then repeat this process till I send my opponents to their respective graveyards. I also want my deck to have as many creatures as possible, so I want to check are the cards in my deck helping or hindering that. In your deck, this check will be how well and how reliably your deck does the thing. Then lastly, is what I'm doing to my deck likely to create a more fun, or at least interesting, play experience for me and the table? I think about this a lot, and while I can't control what other people do, it means that for me and Meren, I'll do things like not run a staple best in slot card like Toxic Deluge, but will instead run Massacre Worm. Toxic Deluge is always going to do the same boring job well, but Massacre Worm, he's going to be okay most of the time, and then he's got a 360 no scope someone when they have 40 Scoot Swarms and think they're untouchable. See? Fun for the whole table. This also means that I don't want to run things like Dictator of Erebos and Grave Pact or Mind Slicer in Meren. I want to build decks that are as strong as possible, whilst not being overly oppressive. And technically these cards would make my deck much stronger, but I'm not playing to win at all costs. I want to leave the game and the pod being willing to play and hopefully eager to play with me again. Now, because I've had a few years worth of games on Meren, I already have observations and things that I already know I want to tweak in the deck. If you know what you want to tweak in your deck, that's great. But if you don't, and you simply want your deck to be stronger, I would say you need to analyze, maybe goldfish, or play more games. If there aren't glaring things or moments where you actively dislike what your deck is doing, or the cards in your hand, maybe your deck is fine as it is. In my deck, I know I want to do three things. Firstly, I want to lower the mana curve. I'd identified a while back that deck operates best when I'm playing lots of small mana dorks. While there's a lot of allure for packing in as many huge impactful creatures into the deck as I can, the mana dorks are good fodder for Meren, and they help the deck feel good and smooth to play. Given this focus on mana curve, I'm also going to review the deck in ascending order of mana cost. I then want to remove some clunkiness. There are a few cards that I find sitting in my hand far longer than I'd like, as I imagine the perfect scenario where I get to cast them. Or there are just cards that I'm never excited to draw. They're not bad cards, but just meh. I want everything to synergize as much as possible, and I want to be happy to see most of the cards that I draw. And lastly, I want to add in a bunch of new cards that go great with the theme. As I said, it's been a year since I made major additions, and Modern Horizons 3 in particular has had a great bunch of cards released for this deck. Likely many of you are in the same boat with a bunch of your decks. So with all that said, let's look through my existing deck and review whether the cards get to stay or get kicked out. I'm going to give cards a tick, cross, or question mark. A tick means the cards are likely staying, a cross means that it's likely gone, and a question mark means that I'm not sure yet, but I probably will be by the end of the process. To make sure this video isn't an hour long, I'm going to write down my thoughts about each card in the black boxes. Pause if you want to read specific ones. For me to want to add a card to the deck, it's got to be better at the same job as an existing card, or do something that I want that's aligned with my theme or the problems I'm trying to solve with the deck better than the existing cards. That means that most of the time, the deficiency in my deck will determine which card I should add, rather than the other way around, and being like a crow getting distracted by tons of new possible cards and then figuring out what to cut afterwards. I think that for most people, that's what really gets them confused in the first place. With this in mind, and focusing on what cards to cut first, if I'm removing a card because it's too slow, but I still want that effect, then I want to replace it with a similar card that has a lower casting cost. Likewise, if I'm removing a card because it's clunky, I probably want to replace it with something that's the opposite of that, whether it be better synergy, an effect that I desperately need, etc. Generally, a card needs to perform a specific function that I need in order for it to be added. That said, sometimes there's simply new cards that are way too strong to ignore. A card that doesn't necessarily have a direct card that it will replace, but it's simply too enticing. In this case, I tend to look to take out the cards that simply make me the least excited. Provided my deck has enough of the fundamentals of a good deck, aka enough land, removal, card draw, etc. If I find myself thinking about adding a card, but it's not immediately clear to me what that card does to fix an existing problem or improve my deck, well then I probably shouldn't add it. As an example in Meren, if I try and simplify this down as much as possible, cards that do the following things won't get stuck in this maybe zone. Firstly, creatures with powerful enter, sacrifice, or death trigger abilities, or just cheap creatures that create mana or fetch lands. Secondly, cards that help me get cards from my deck, hand, or battlefield into the graveyard. And lastly, cards that help me get said creatures from my graveyard back into play. And with this in mind, here's a group of cards that I shortlisted for my Meren deck. Based on all this, the key lesson about cutting cards from your deck is this. If you figured out what you want your deck to do, and the types of cards that support that, then it should be very easy to figure out what you can or should cut from your deck to fit in shiny new cards. That is, of course, assuming that these new cards are actually better for what you're trying to do and you haven't just gone full crow mode. But again, properly assessing your deck will give you those answers. If you enjoyed this, all I ask is that you share this video with your fellow cardboard enjoyers, be that in person, Discord, or wherever you congregate. That way they too can fine-tune their decks to hopefully be better, more fun, and less cringe. And last but not least, my fellow Meren enjoyers, here's the swaps that I ended up making. They're not one-to-one, but I've tried to match them up as straight swaps wherever I could. And if you want to know why I made a particular cut or inclusion, put it in the comments and I'll give you as much context as you want. Enjoy the elevator music, and thanks for watching.